Okay, so we're looking at the Senate. And as I said before, that if you know the simple fact that the Senate plus the House of Representatives is Congress, Senate plus the House equals Congress, then you are more informed, I believe, than most Americans, because people missay those things all the time. And so we looked at the other chamber of the legislature, the other chamber of Congress, the House, which represents the people under proportional representation. And now we're going to look at the opposite chamber, the Senate. And this is one of those areas where the Constitution tries to forge a compromise, and we have to kind of look at whether or not that was a good idea. We'll look at the rules the Senate works by, the requirements, and how it's changed over time, particularly with the 17th Amendment. You guys like Star Wars? There's this clip in here from the Emperor, who's the bad guy in Star Wars, saying, "I am the Senate." So when he gets confronted about his power grab and he's kind of revealing himself as the bad guy, he lets them know that he believes himself to be the Senate, the ruler, the controller of all things. So he's the emperor in this. He's the tries to grab power that way. You may or may not recognize these women, and over time I may have to change this, but you'll almost definitely now recognize or have heard the name of the woman on the right, because she is Joe Biden's vice presidential candidate in the 2020 election. So this is Kamala Harris. She's from California, was a state prosecutor for the state of California and one of the senators. Over here on the left, you may probably not recognize this lady. Over the years when I've shown these pictures to people, most people don't know who they are, but the name might sound familiar. So on the left, we've got Dianne Feinstein, U.S. State Senator, Democrat from California, and how long she's been in the Senate. And Kamala Harris, Democrat from California, has been a senator since 2017. Okay, now senators in the United States, their term is a 2-year term. Okay, so I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing. A 6-year term. I was confusing with the House. Is a 6-year term. Now, but notice Dianne Feinstein has been there since 1992. That's 28 years. So how is it a 6-year term? Well, the terms are 6 years, but you can continue being reelected. As long as people keep voting for you and you're willing and able, you can continue being in the Senate or in the House. The House is the same thing. Every 2 years, there's an election. And if you keep winning, you can continue in that office. And it used to be the same with the presidency, but we'll talk about that at another time. Now, I discussed this story before that may or may not have been told by George Washington, but this was a good analogy either way of the bicameral legislature, meaning the two chambers, why they had two chambers. And the story goes that according to Washington, the House is like the teacup that holds the turbulence of democracy and represents popular will. That the House of Representatives is the people's house. That it is about democracy. That it represents the will of the people. That it tries to get popular law. And so for that purpose, it's democratic. The House is bigger, it has more people. It's based on proportional representation, based on the population of the state. Represents districts, people in their own district, their own hometown. It's younger on average because you can be 25, be in the House. Now, most people are a lot older than that in the House, but you can be 25. it's more short-term focused. People are elected for 2 years at a time, although they can serve longer. And so that is the focus of what the House is. It's supposed to be kind of hold all the turbulence of democracy, the kind of hot tea. Now, the saucer, according to the story Washington allegedly told, was that the saucer is to cool off the tea. What you used to do with a saucer is you used to pour tea out onto it, and it would dissipate, the heat would dissipate and it would cool off a little bit, and then you drink it from there, or you'd pour it back into the cup, and that's what the saucer was for. And so Washington said, okay, well, the Senate is not democratic, it's aristocratic. It does not represent the people, it represents the states. The senators are supposed to be ambassadors for their state, as their states are kind of considered self-governing independent countries. At least they were in the beginning. And so the Senate is supposed to represent not as much popular law, but deliberation and ideally good law, at least in theory. That it's supposed to be the branch of more wisdom, experience, and maturity to balance out the younger and less mature branch that represents the popular will of the people. Senate, you can serve longer, more long-term focus. Senate, you have to be older, you have to be 30 years old. And the Senate is more collegial and formal, and the House is more informal. And so the idea is there's supposed to be a balance between these two chambers. And it's kind of an interesting idea. And the Americans weren't the first ones to think of what's called a bicameral legislature, but the way they formatted it was kind of clever. And we'll talk about why, and we'll see whether or not that was actually worked out. Edmund Randolph, the earlier founder's not as well known, but talked about that the role of the Senate was to provide balance against the turbulence and follies of democracy. And so the point was that the Senate was to balance out popular government, balance out democracy so that you could have the good elements of democracy without the bad elements of democracy, or you would limit the bad elements of democracy by slowing the government down, requiring certain things according to the Constitution in order to use power and write law, and creating layers of power and authority so that it wasn't easy to just do whatever you want. And so that's kind of what the Senate is supposed to be. Requirements from the Senate. Each state, according to the Constitution, gets 2 senators. No matter what, no matter the size of the state, no matter the state's population, no matter how many people it has, each state gets 2 senators because the purpose of the Senate is the equality of the states, the equal representation of the states. Now, this is one of those areas, it's common in the Constitution, where they compromised. They had 2 sides that both had valid points when they were trying to decide representation. The one side said, if we have a bigger state with more people demands more representation in the government. Okay, that kind of makes sense. But on the other side, you have states saying, wait a second, we are self-governing independent governments. And a self-governing independent government does not compare itself with another one based on size, but based on authority. Meaning, little Rhode Island, they separated from Britain. They declared independence. They had their own government. They were a country too. So why should just a country simply because it has, or a state just because it has more people, get to have more power? Why would a state like Rhode Island or any other smaller state join into that situation where the states with more people could override them and overrule them via the federal government? Wouldn't that end up making Rhode Island and other states subservient to the will of California? So since the states are all supposed to be multiple self-governing countries of that independent status, then they should all be equal. And so the Constitution, they debated this, and they tried to do both. They tried to compromise and do both. And they came up with a clever resolution to the problem. But I say clever, but I'm not so sure it really solved the problem they intended to solve. It did solve the problem of compromise, but I don't know that it really solved the problem of one type of representation versus the other. Because here's kind of what I've come to after studying this for a couple years. I think I just drew this conclusion while I was teaching on this material last year, that if you really think about it, okay, they tried to do both. Every state gets 2 senators. Texas gets 2 senators. Hawaii gets 2 senators. California gets 2 senators. Florida gets 2 senators. Every state, without exception, gets 2 senators. But in the House, every state is represented proportionally. So let me use California and Montana as an example. Montana has 1 representative. California has 53. California has more voting power in the House than Montana. Now, here's the problem I see with the Constitution trying to do it both ways, is that, yes, Montana has 2 senators and California gets 2 senators. They're equal, but in the House, California gets 53 and Montana gets 1. So representing them in the government of the United States, Montana has 3 total because of the 2 senators and 1 representative, and California gets 55. Won't that mean that ultimately California, more often than not, will have its will in the federal government over the state of Montana? I know it takes both the Senate and the House to work together, but I think that when you try to do that, when you try to mix 2 things, that often it becomes one or the other, right? Or you undermine them both. And so arguably that's what happened in the Constitution. So let's extrapolate this out, do a little deductive mathematical reasoning. 2 senators from each state. There are currently 50 states. It doesn't have to be that number, and it wasn't always. But there are currently now 50 states in the United States. How many senators are there? It comes out to 50 times 2, 100 senators. If there's a new state added someday in the future, it'll be 102. Started out with 26, right? Because of the 13 original states. Now, each senator has 1 vote. So this kind of follows pattern of like the old Greco-Roman senates, things like that. But maybe you've recognized a problem. When you have an even amount of voters, the results can be that you vote one way, vote another way, but there's also a third thing that can happen when you have an even number. House doesn't have this problem because it has 435, has odd number. But when you have an even number, you can tie. So in this case, there could be 50-50. Well, how does the tie get resolved. People could change their mind, that's true, but if they don't, there is a constitutional way to break the tie. And the tie is broken by the President of the Senate. President of the Senate. The President of the Senate actually holds another title, but has very little or very few constitutional powers. Very few things are said about the individual who holds this position. But this is one thing that they do when there is a tie in the Senate. They are the President of the Senate to preside over the Senate. They don't participate in debate or anything like that most of the time, but they do come in to break the tie. And the President of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States, holds the tie-breaking vote. And so every once in a while, not that often, but probably more often than people think, there is a chance for a tie. And very early in the Union, when there were only 26 senators, George Washington was president, John Adams was vice president. John Adams had to break quite a few ties. Now, when there's more people, it's a little less likely that a tie will occur, but it still can. Each of them has a 6-year term, but can continue being reelected. Now, whether or not that's a good thing is something you'll have to think about. Is it a good idea that senators can continue to be reelected for years on end without limits to the terms? People like the limits on the terms on the presidency, but that's actually fairly new. That was done after World War II. Before that, it was just a tradition, not a law, that the president stepped down after 2 terms. It became law after a president was elected 4 times, but that was Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, and then he died in office. Then a constitutional amendment was created to change that. So it's kind of a new thing that the president steps down after 2 terms. But the House and the Senate, neither of them require stepping down after a certain amount of terms. You have to be 30 years old to be in the Senate. Okay, so you have to be a little older than the House. Most people in the Senate are not 30 years old. They're a lot older, typically. I think Dianne Feinstein, who I just showed us at the beginning, is in her 70s or 80s now. So just to put in some perspective. John Dickinson, early founder, talked about the purpose of the Senate, the preservation of the states with a certain degree of agency, and he talked about the idea of collision between different authorities. Okay, so that's not just the checks and balances between the branches of the federal government, but this is the senators representing the states. So the states, in their capacity as senators, there's layers of authority here that collide and make it difficult on purpose for the government to function. It's checks and balances. But again, the checks and balances are not just between the 3 branches of the federal government, but also between the federal government and the states. And that, in this case, is represented by the senators. Now, John Dickinson explained the reason why the senators are not elected by the people. The senators were not elected by the people of the states originally, and purposely not. They were elected by their state government. So the people, for example, this is how it used to work. The people of California would elect California state representatives, meaning people who would represent us in the government of the state of California. Then those people would choose or elect senators who would serve as ambassadors in the U.S. Senate to represent the state government of California, making the state government of California very powerful in the US federal government because it would have a direct say over what the senators were doing. And so this is how the states maintain some power and agency in the union. He said the reason why we don't have the people elect the senators is because that would take the problems of democracy from within the states and just make them bigger into the United States. That would take all the issues of democracy and just export them to the US federal level. So he said that the Senate is supposed to represent the equality of the states, and that's why the state legislatures appoint or elect senators. At least they did. It's not that way anymore because of the 17th Amendment. So the Senate was meant to be a check on the general or the national government of the United States. Dickinson explained that the excesses of democracy seen in the states would carry over to the national government if the people elected the senators, right? So same problems, only on a bigger scale. Another early founder, not as well known, George Mason, talked about the reason that, so the national government had authority given to it by the states, but he talked about a certain portion must necessarily be left with the states. And for that reason, the state legislatures participate in appointing senators. Let's look at some powers here of the Senate. So, as I said, the Senate was meant to be the branch or a branch through which the states could check the national government. This is how the states actually participate in the US federal government, is through their senators. And so the senators were elected by state legislatures. Therefore, the states controlled the Senate. So if you think about that, so like this is how it used to work. It doesn't work this way anymore. But the state of California would appoint 2 senators to go represent the state of California and the government of California in Washington, D.C. in the Senate. Now, while they're there, yes, the senators have some agency and they're making their own decisions, but they are also communicating back and forth with the government of California. And if the government of California tells them to do something, not do something, vote for something, vote against something, and the senators do not follow those instructions, the state of California could recall them home and replace them. The state of California could censure them. They could hold them accountable for their behavior as senators. How would you, today, the people elect the senators? Well, okay, how would you hold a senator accountable? You could vote for them every 6 years, but that means they have 6 years of unaccountable behavior, potentially, not listening to the state government, not listening to you as the people, and listening to all sorts of other interests, their party, other states, other entities, with little to no accountability. But back in the day, the state governments could control them. They could say, no, you don't get to go out there and be the person who we sent to represent us and then do things against us at our expense. Get back here and we're going to replace you with somebody else. It's pretty substantial power. And the senators were supposed to, well, they actually do today as well. Senators, House, President, Supreme Court, they all swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. So this is the position a senator would have been in. Not that they followed through on this consistently, but in theory, this is the pressures that were supposed to be brought to bear on a senator. They had, and I think, at least in my mind, 3 questions that they had to be responsible for and answerable to their state government and to their state as a whole. Number one, so the Senate is supposed to work on making legislation, writing law, working with the House to craft law to get to the president. The law is signed by the president or vetoed, meaning that it goes back, okay? Debating on policy, law, all these things. That's what the legislature is. It's the law-making body. And these are laws for the whole United States. But there are at least two primary considerations. I'm going to add a third one as well. Number one, the senator had to consider, is this legislation, this law that others are proposing or that they want me to vote for and be involved in, is it in the interest of my home state? Yes or no? And it may not be that as simple to answer as just a affirmative or a negative, but ultimately they have to decide on that. Yes or no? Number two, is this legislation constitutional? Does the Constitution give Congress the power to do this? Does this go against anything in the Constitution? Does this take a power that the Constitution does not grant? Does it raise money for things that are not described in the Constitution? So number one, is it in the interest of my home state government? Number two, is it constitutional because I have sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution? If there was an answer no to either of those questions or both of them, then arguably the senator would have had a responsibility, a duty to vote against any such legislation. That's the theory. It doesn't mean that they did that, but that's how it was supposed to go. And if they weren't faithful to those things, their home state's interests and their constitution, their oath to the Constitution, their home state could bring them back. Third question, and they're purposely in that order, but third question is this legislation a good idea? So even before you get to that, you have to ask, will this be good for my home state? Is it constitutional? And if you can check yes to both of those things, then, and only then, would a senator be able to look at and see, is this a good idea? Now, something can be a good idea and be unconstitutional. Well, what do you do in that case? Well, then that would be a case where you would suggest the idea of making a constitutional amendment for something that's a good idea, arguably. That's debatable, right? Subjective, but good idea, but unconstitutional. And so this was the pressure that was brought to bear on the senators. This was the idea of, okay, well, this is why the senators will always represent their states. Now, of course, that wasn't always true. Senate also can check all three branches of the federal government. They can block legislation from the House. That's the other side of Congress, right? The Congress, the House and the Senate have to work together to craft legislation that has to agree in dollars and language before it can go to the president to be signed into law, where the president can also reject it. The Senate can also block presidential appointments. The president appoints people to certain cabinet positions in the executive agencies, and that is with the approval of, or lack thereof, of the Senate. So they get the final say. The president can choose whoever. That the president can block certain people? No. The president doesn't block people. The president appoints people to an executive agency or to like a judicial position like we're seeing right now with like the Supreme Court, but the Senate can block that appointment. The Senate gives the final yes or no by a vote of whether or not they approve the president's choice. So that's number 3 on there. That's how they can block the president and the Supreme Court, is that the president can appoint someone, for example, like right now, Trump appointed someone to the Supreme Court. She's going through the process now in the Senate, them asking her a bunch of questions and stuff, and then they're going to vote, but she cannot take that position that the president has appointed her to until the Senate gives its approval. And if they don't give their approval, she can't take that position. Okay, so it's a pretty substantial power. The president also has the right to make treaties, according to the Constitution, make treaties with foreign nations. That's one of the things the states gave up to be part of the United States. So, for example, the state of California cannot go make a treaty with France. But the president of the United States can make a treaty with France. But what if that negatively affects California? Well, then the California state senators can vote against that treaty, or if it goes against the Constitution, they can vote against that treaty. And if they have enough votes on their side, then the treaty doesn't go through. And also they have the power to try impeachments. Now, I'll rock your world here for a minute and tell you that impeachment does not mean removal. That's what most people think it means. It does not mean that, nor does it guarantee that. An impeachment is simply a bringing up of charges against the president that may lead to a decision of removal. It does not guarantee that. Presidents have been impeached, but they have not. No president thus far has ever been removed from office. Now, impeachment starts in the House. The House has to bring up charges of impeachment. The Senate then has to decide whether or not to proceed with those charges and to have a trial. But the Senate, if it does decide to proceed, acts in a quasi-judicial way. So it's kind of becomes its own version of a court. And the president is on trial and they bring witnesses and they talk. And then the Senate decides whether or not it will remove or acquit the president. And presiding over that is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So it involves all 3 branches. It's kind of interesting how that works. So there's some complications there, but that's what the Constitution says. So the Senate and the states via the Senate have some pretty important constitutional powers. Now, the states don't have as many constitutional powers via the Senate anymore because there's now a disconnect between the state governments and the senators. And that's because of the 17th Amendment. The original Constitution stipulated that the senators were chosen by the legislatures of the state. Now, that could be through an election by the legislatures, or maybe they just appointed people, chose people that there was a firm agreement on. The amended text said that 2 senators from each state. Now, that meant that we as the people now of California elect senators to the Senate. And that partially sounds good in the sense, okay, well, it's more democratic. We get to vote for senators. We want to have a say. Why not have us participate in that process? But remember, the Senate is not supposed to be democratic. So can it work with this changing function? This is a change in 1913, the 17th Amendment that happened to the Constitution. Big changes in 1913, lots of them. Income tax amendment, the 16th Amendment also happens. 17th Amendment happens in that time, change of senators, which people underestimate. And then the World War I starts in 1914. So major things going on in the United States and the world during that time. I could mention others as well. But by this change, in short, this disconnected direct accountability from state governments and legislatures over their senators. So now senators are no longer accountable to the state governments of the states they represent. Are they accountable to the people? Yes, but the people cannot have the same direct control over the senators. You could write a letter, you could try to vote them out, we could try to do those things, but we don't exercise that level of control. And by removing that, it undermined the authority of the state governments. Because now the senators can travel all over the 50 states, making promises, raising money, promising to uphold the interests of political parties or special interests. And then they can come back to their home state, make all these promises to the people, get elected by the people, and then have no accountability for 6 years. And the state government is powerless to do anything to these senators to get them to make sure that they're doing things in the interest of their state. So that means that state senators from California could do things at the expense of California for 6 years. California state government can't do anything about it because it has no responsibility over the senators anymore. It doesn't choose the senators. It doesn't instruct the senators anymore. And for that reason, they no longer are beholden to the state governments of the states that they're supposed to represent. Now, it doesn't mean the state of California by any means is perfect or would always tell the senators to do the right thing. But it means that the power has shifted now from the state governments to the federal government. And whether or not you think that's a good thing, I will say this, that remember the original idea of the American Revolution was that the states should be independent, self-governing entities. The Constitution, they were very similarly supposed to independently govern in a federal union with one another, with a federal government defined by the Constitution. But once the 17th Amendment disconnected them from that, the states lost power, and that power became concentrated in the US federal government. And so do the senators really even represent the states anymore? Is kind of a question you have to think about, right? But we will end that there.